Hi, everyone. Welcome to the third webinar in this series for the Kemptville Winter Woodlot Conference. My name is Olivia, and I am the moderator of this year's series. Today, we're looking forward to hearing from Dr. Jessica Forrest about pollinators in Northeastern hardwood forests. We'd like to thank the sponsors who you can see on the screen, as well as the planning committee and all of the speakers throughout this webinar series for making it a reality. And now I would like to pass it over to Dorothy Hamilton, one of our committee members, to introduce today's speaker. Go ahead, Dorothy.
Okay, thank you, Olivia. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our third presentation in the Kemptville Winter Woodlot Conference. In case you didn't notice, we decided to upgrade the winter aspect of it, providing 2 great big dumps of snow over the past week. So I hope everybody enjoys that part of the title. Wanted to say that we kind of this year we kind of diversified ourselves. We have both the last 2 topics are not ones that we have presented in the past. I sort of looked through our history and saw to see if we had any presentations on this, and pollinators was definitely not there. So I'm really looking forward to this presentation. And so I'm going to introduce I want to first of all thank Kerry Coleman, because he was the one that suggested Jessica to our conference webinars. And so I will now introduce Jessica. She is going to talk about pollinators in the Northeastern hardwood forests. Most of the dominant trees in the Northeast forests are pollinated by wind, yet pollinating insects play an important role in the forest ecosystem by ensuring seed production and genetic mixing in many understory plants. So Jessica is going to provide an overview of the different types of pollinators that occur in our Northeastern hardwood forests. Jessica is an associate professor in the biology department at the University of Ottawa, where she conducts research on ecology and the evolution of wild pollinators, especially native bees, in their interactions with plants. She also teaches upper-level ecology courses and serves as the co-director of the biology department's graduate program. She, her students, and Oscar do field work in the Ottawa area in agricultural, urban, and natural areas. So now I'll turn the presentation over to Jessica. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Okay, let me just work on sharing my screen here. Okay, is that visible to everyone?
Yes, it is.
And you can hear me okay, I guess.
We can hear you perfectly.
Okay, great. So thank you very much for the invitation. I have never spoken to a woodlot conference before. And despite what you might expect from my last name, I actually have not spent my entire career working on forests. My training actually as a pollination ecologist was mainly working in the Colorado Rockies and subalpine meadows out there. And I also did some work in agricultural settings in California. But since starting my position at the University of Ottawa, which was 12 years ago now, I've been working more and more on the hardwood forests around here, especially Gatineau Park. And so what I'm going to present today is based on work that has been done in my lab, mainly by my students and postdocs in the local forests here, but I will also draw on some really great work that's been done by other research groups at other institutions. So I thought I'd start by just talking about sort of how I perceive the forest environment. And I imagine this is similar to what all of you see as fellow human beings. We have this perspective. Most of the time we're at, 5 or 6 feet above ground. We might crouch down to admire the flowering plants on the forest understory, on the forest floor. But, we see a lot of tree trunks and some leaves, but really our focus is mostly going to be in this sort of lower couple of meters of the forest. And we have a bias towards that portion of the forest environment, but there's also good reasons to be interested in this part of the forest environment, including if you're interested in bees and other pollinators. So the understory environment contains a huge amount of diversity. And one estimate is that it contains about 80% of the plant diversity that's contained in North American temperate forests. And obviously I've just got a few photos of some of our local forest understory species here. One of the conspicuous features that's unique to deciduous forests is that the understory environment is brilliantly sunny before the canopy trees leaf out. And I'm sure you've all experienced this. You've probably walked in the forest in the spring and admired the light, the wildflowers, maybe even the insect activity around you. And then, of course, as the season progresses, it gets shadier. Mosquitoes appreciate the shade. It becomes, in some ways, a less inviting atmosphere as the season progresses, at least in my view. So that's sort of a qualitative impression. Here are actually some data. This is from a paper by Ben Lee and colleagues that came out last year, and he's just talking about the understory environment and how understory plants experience it. So this graph is showing light levels in the Michigan forest understory over the course of the year, just showing what I'm sure you've all experienced, the fact that light is super intense in the early spring, but then as trees leaf out, it becomes actually quite dark over the course of the summer. And then you get a bit more light in the fall as the trees lose their leaves, but we have less sunlight at that time of year. And obviously it's not very conducive to plant growth because of the low temperatures as well. But that pulse of light in the spring is really one of the defining features of temperate hardwood forests. And there are a whole lot of plants that take advantage of this period of high light intensity to flower, and in some cases to do all of their photosynthesis. And so these are the plants that we know as spring ephemerals. Dutchman's breeches or Dicentra cucularia is one example of this life history. So these are plants, they send up their leaves first thing as soon as the snow melts, they flower, they do all of their photosynthesis for the year, and then their above ground foliage and their flower stems, everything just dies by May. Now, of course, the plant is not dead, it's living underground. The corms will resurrect the plant the following spring. But it looks like just a dead plant as soon as we get to the time when the light levels decline. So that's the spring ephemeral life history. That's not the only life history of understory plants. This graph from the same paper sort of, it shows a cartoon version of the different kinds of understory plants that we see in our hardwood forests. And so there's some like hepaticas, which are actually evergreen. So they flower during that period of high light in the spring, but their leaves are green year round. There are the spring ephemerals, and then there are plants like Jack in the Pulpit that do their flowering and photosynthesis through the summer, even though light levels are relatively low. They're just tolerant of that shade. Now, why do all of these plants? It makes sense that plants would photosynthesize when light levels are high in the spring, but why do they flower when those light levels are high? Well, part of the reason is that's when pollinators are active too. So the pollinators also benefit from the sunny understory environment in the spring. But if you're a pollinator, you aren't confined to just the lower couple meters of the forest environment. Virtually all of our important local pollinators have wings, and they can move easily between the forest understory and the canopy. And so that's one thing I want to really draw attention to in this talk is the importance of the canopy environment for pollinators. We, being earthbound mortals, do not experience the canopy environment as much as flying insects do. And it's, of course, a very different habitat, but it's also very important for flying insects. And we're really just, as researchers, we're really just beginning to appreciate just how important it is for pollinators. So obviously the canopy environment is much more exposed, it can be much windier than the understory. But what it provides as sort of compensatory benefits are sometimes very abundant floral resources. So if a maple tree is in flower, it is producing huge numbers of flowers. They're not very conspicuous or showy, but they are flowers and they have pollen and nectar. Many other trees only produce pollen. They don't produce nectar. So this is an oak inflorescence. And these plants, these trees in particular, seem really adapted for wind pollination, in the sense that they don't provide nectar as an attractant to pollinators. But nevertheless, they are providing pollen, so a potential resource for pollinators. And the other thing that's present in the forest canopy that we don't necessarily think about is a whole lot of plant-feeding insects, and specifically sap-feeding insects, like aphids and related insects that produce honeydew. And so they are producing another sugar source that can be exploited by some kinds of bees and wasps and some other insects. There can be other sugar sources as well. So some plants like poplars can produce some extra floral nectar on their leaves. And even just sap from wounds in trees can be exploited by pollinators that are frequenting the canopy. So who are these pollinators? I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about this, and what I know about who these pollinators are comes from work that has been done in my lab, as well as a variety of papers published by researchers over the last, I'll say 50 years or so. There's some really classic great papers describing the pollinator ecology of hardwood forests in southern Canada and northeastern US. And the work that has been done in my lab and by those other groups is really based on two different kinds of sampling methods. And one, and it's definitely my preferred method, is just focal observations of particular wildflowers. So sometimes we just sit out in the forest and we watch who comes to visit different species of plants. And you can learn a lot from doing that. It's my preferred method because it's non-lethal to the bees or other pollinators. We just watch them come and go. The disadvantage to it is that we often cannot identify those pollinators very well unless we capture them. And so that's why we use another method as well. And I don't love this method because it can result in quite a bit of bycatch, so unintended consequences, like this spider who ended up in this, what we call a bee bowl. So these are a type of passive trap used for collecting pollinators. They're super unsophisticated, just a plastic bowl. We used white for this work because most of the flowers that bloom in the forest understory in the spring do have white flowers. So we use these white bowls, we just fill them with a little bit of water and a drop of soap to break the surface tension. And bees and flies and some other things are basically drawn to these bowls and then drown in them. So again, I don't like doing it, but what it does get us eventually is some pinned specimens that we can look at under the microscope to be able to identify these insects to the species level. Yeah, I can talk more about that process if people are interested, but I'll leave it at that for now. And so the main groups of pollinators that are really important in the forest are, first of all, flies. And I'm not going to talk so much about flies because my expertise is really more with bees, although I have worked on flies in the past. But I don't want to disregard flies entirely because they are a super diverse group. There's over 9,000 species documented in Canada. They aren't all pollinators, but many of them are. And they can be extremely important pollinators. For example, this tachinid fly, E. palpus signifer, is active in the very early spring. Here it is visiting spring beauty, I believe. And that's something that flies are really known for, is they can be active when it's cool out. And so they can be the most important pollinators up in the Arctic, and they can also be quite important for springtime wildflowers. These bombolea bee flies are another group that you often will see in the spring, and they can be important visitors to many flowering plants. But there's a whole bunch of other flies. Some of them just look like regular house flies, but they're not. Some of them are dance flies. There's these flower flies. Many of these species are a bit hairy. They can get covered in pollen and they can effectively transport pollen between plants and thereby enable pollination. Now, flies have a variety of larval lifestyles, as I'm sure you know. So mosquitoes, obviously, the larvae are aquatic, and black flies, the same is true, but there are a whole range of life histories among the flies. So tachinid larvae can be parasitoids, so parasites, internal parasites of other insects, or even in some, for some kinds of flies, they parasitize earthworms, or other animals. Some flies, of course, the larvae are maggots that develop in excrement or carrion, all kinds of disgusting things, or just decaying organic matter. In any case, they can be quite abundant and diverse in forests, and they can be important pollinators. But the group that I am most passionate about is the bees. And while their diversity doesn't compare to that of flies, it's not too shabby either. There are about 20,000 species worldwide, and we've got about at least 900 in Canada. And these are just a few photos of some of my favorite bees on this slide. Now, what makes bees so famous as pollinators? It's really a couple of things. So one is that bees, unlike flies, depend on pollen and nectar, so floral resources, throughout their lives. So adult flies will visit flowers to get pollen, or to get nectar, and sometimes also pollen for their own nutrition. And bees will also do that. So bees also consume nectar from flowers and pollen for their own nutritional needs. But their larvae also develop through feeding on pollen and nectar. And so the entire life cycle of virtually all bees is dependent on floral resources. So bees are just intimately tied to flowers. And I should say also, because I sometimes take this for granted, but there's no reason that people should know, but nectar is essentially sugar water that's produced solely as a reward for pollinators. Not all plants produce nectar, but many do as an attractant. Whereas pollen, it's sort of like plant sperm. So it serves a role in plant reproduction independent of its role in attracting pollinators. But many pollinators will also consume pollen. And it's the protein and lipid source for developing bees. So nectar provides sugar, pollen provides all of the essential nutrients for bee larvae. So these are some bee larvae here on the right. And they're happily feeding on these balls of pollen and nectar that their mother has provided for them. This is a queen bumblebee here in the middle, and you can see she's got this mass of pollen and nectar pressed onto her hind legs, her pollen basket. So that's one thing that makes bees really good pollinators, is that they're dependent on flowers throughout their lives. The other thing, and this is actually, it's not a very useful trait for recognizing bees, but it is the trait that defines bees, is that they have these uniquely branched hairs. So this is a microscopic image of bee hairs. You can see they've got all these little fine branches on them. You can't see it with the naked eye, but under a microscope, it's pretty obvious. And the function of these branched hairs is not totally obvious, but it seems like it probably helps them hold on to pollen grains. So that relates to just the general point that bees are often, not always, but often quite hairy, and that hairiness can allow them to carry a lot of pollen and deposit a lot of pollen on other flowers. Okay, so I told you there are 900-ish species of bees in Canada. One of them that I want to say a few words about is the European honeybee, Apis mellifera. And I'm guessing if there's about 50 people in this webinar, there's probably someone that keeps honeybees. And certainly you've all seen honeybees, and probably most people have had honey. Honeybees get a lot of attention, and in some ways that's appropriate. They're really wonderful animals. They have amazing modes of communication. Their social life is incredible. They're super useful for agricultural pollination. Really fascinating animals. But I want to be clear that that's really not the pollinator I'm going to talk about in this talk. It's a species that is not native to North America. It was introduced by Europeans. Contrary to what you might have heard, it is not an endangered species. It's extremely abundant worldwide. Yes, beekeepers sometimes have tough seasons, and that's been certainly true in the last few decades. They have a lot of challenges they have to deal with, but that I view that essentially as a livestock management problem. It's not an environmental problem. So I can talk about that more later. I could talk about that at length, but that's all I'll say for now. So just to say, I'm going to focus on the native pollinators, which have a long history of association with our native forests. Okay, and among those native pollinators, probably the most conspicuous and famous group is the bumblebees. So I'm sure everyone has seen bumblebees. There are about 27 species native to Eastern Canada. The most common one, the common eastern bumblebee, I'm sure you've all seen it. It's active early in spring. And it's just very common even in cities. But we have a variety of other species. Some of them have this beautiful orange or reddish color on them. I'll say a few words about the bumblebee life cycle because it's quite unique, and I'm sure you will have seen portions of it, even if you were not necessarily aware of the entire life cycle. So the way they work is queens overwinter on their own. The illustration here shows a bee hibernating in the soil. So she's excavated this little sort of burrow for herself. The queen will emerge in the spring and forage. So she'll visit flowers for her own nectar and energy needs. And she will also look around for a suitable place to build a nest. And so you may have seen both of those behaviors in the spring. So certainly you can see queens visiting flowers, but you may also have noticed them flying slowly over the ground, not visiting flowers. And what they're doing there is nest searching. And so queen bumblebee, once she finds a suitable location, which could be an abandoned mouse burrow or a crevice between some rocks and a rock wall, or sometimes they go under buildings, or it could be a hole in a tree, depends on the species. She will begin construction of a honey pot and a ball of pollen and nectar. And so that's going to be her colony. So she will work on her own for a little while to fill her pot with nectar, which she'll convert into honey, and to build this ball of pollen. She'll then lay eggs on the pollen ball and incubate it. So bumblebees are really neat among bees. They're kind of special in how well they can thermoregulate. So many kinds of bees have some capacity to warm up their body temperature, but bumblebees are especially good at this. So you may have heard of insects being cold-blooded, but that's really a simplification because bees are quite able to generate body heat, and bumblebees can do this quite well and retain it quite well thanks to their fur. So they incubate the brood, and eventually the brood, the offspring produced by the queen, will develop into adults and emerge as workers, which are much smaller than the queens. So in the early spring, the bees you see are queens. They're enormous. And then you stop seeing the queens after a few weeks. At that point, they become just basically egg producing and incubating animals. And then the workers really take over the foraging business by midsummer. Now, the colony continues to grow over the course of the summer and eventually transitions to making new queens and males. And those males and new queens will leave the colony to mate. And then at the end of the season, everybody dies except the inseminated queens, who will then find a place to hibernate and repeat the cycle. So again, just to be clear about the contrast with honeybees, if you do know about honeybees, the queen honeybee will never be on her own. She is always accompanied by workers, and is normally only in the hive, except when a swarm is forming. So that's quite different from the bumblebee life cycle, where queens can be fully independent for a portion of the life cycle. Okay, so bumblebees are wonderful and they can be very important pollinators. But most bees are actually not social. In other words, do not make colonies like honeybees and bumblebees do. And they do not make honey either. And so most bees, we call them solitary bees. Some of them live in small groups, but they're not truly colony forming. And so that's most of our species in Canada. There's over 300 solitary bee species in Eastern Canada, and these are just a few of them shown here. Life cycles of solitary bees vary quite a bit, but here's a simplified representation of sort of a typical one, where again, adults emerge in the spring or the summer, depending on the species. In this case, adult males and females emerge, they mate, and then females forage for pollen and nectar, and dig burrows or find another suitable place to nest, where they provide for their offspring. In this case, what's shown is a mining bee, and so the nest is dug in the ground, and in these little chambers within the underground burrow, the bee lays an egg and provides pollen and nectar for the young. And again, the egg hatches into a larva, it undergoes metamorphosis, eventually becomes an adult that then emerges usually the following year. So winter can occur at different points in the life cycle, depending on the species. So sometimes it's larvae that overwinter, and sometimes it's adults that overwinter. The bee species that are active in the spring are the ones that overwintered as adults. So as I alluded to just there, some species of bees nest underground. In fact, the majority do. Some are referred to specifically as mining bees, but there's various kinds of bees that dig underground burrows. This is an entrance to a bee burrow. Here's an excavated bee burrow where you can actually see some of the brood cells, and you get a sense of the depth that some bees will dig to make those nests. But there are other species that nest in wood or in hollow stems. So you see a couple of examples here. And in those nests, if you cut them open, you can see, again, the same kind of thing that I showed in the previous slides, where you have these masses of pollen and nectar and individual larvae developing inside each brood cell. Okay, so I'm gonna move on now to talk a little bit about what we see in terms of bee activity specifically in hardwood forests. And again, my data come from Gatineau Park near here. And the first data I'll show you are for bee phenology. So phenology is the timing, the seasonal timing of activity. And I had a student, Manuel Savinello, who worked on this project for a few years. And I'll show you 3 years of data here. And what I'm going to be plotting, so this is for 2016, I'll show you 2017, 2018, but what it's showing here is the day of year for 2 species of wildflowers that we tracked blooming of, and then 3 types of bees that we were collecting in those pan traps or bee bowls that I showed before. And so what you can see here is, this is these violin plots basically represent the density of observation. So you can see that the peak flowering of Hepatica occurred in sort of late April. And then this is Trillium flowering a bit later, mid-May. And then the bees all sort of coinciding with Hepatica in mid to late April, early May. And I'll just layer on here, in this spring, the April average temperature was 4.5 degrees Celsius, and snowmelt was around on April 14th. So I've plotted that on there. And what I want to show you here is just that these bees, which are the most abundant groups of bees that we captured in the forest and that most people report as being forest associated, all 3 groups are consistently active pretty much immediately after snow melts in our forested plots. So even though timing of snowmelt varies year to year and the timing of bloom of Hepatica varies along with it, the bees have basically always shown up sort of reliably right on time as soon as the snow melts and those flowers are available. And I'll mention that the first bees we see are males. So males tend, almost in all species, the males emerge first. And so the very first bees you'll see on the forest floor are males who do need nectar to meet their nutritional needs, but they don't actually do any nesting themselves. So they'll just be out there basically ready and waiting for the females to come out, at which point they can mate, and the females will then do the nesting. Okay. So those are the sort of three groups. The Nomada, Andrina, and Lasioglossum are our three common groups of bees that we see in forests. I'll just put that in a bit of perspective. So in our sampling, just in this one location within Gatineau Park, we've collected at least 29 bee species. I'm sure there's way more than that. Those are just the ones we've identified as species, and it's in just one area of the park. To give you a bit of a better sense from a broader area, a study from New York State documented 90 bee species across 6 second growth forest sites, and that represents a pretty substantial fraction of all the species known from the state. And then finally, an even broader study looking at bees across several states in the northeastern US and looking at their habitat associations found that close to a third of all bee species in the region are forest associated. And that makes sense in that, you know, forests are the dominant land cover in this part of the world, you know, pre-agriculture, pre-agricultural intensification. So it makes sense there would be species associated with forests. And yet it's something that has in the past been a bit underappreciated because we more often notice bees out in open habitats and meadows. And probably part of the reason is that if you are sampling for bees in the middle of summer, that's where most of the bees are. They're out in open habitats. It's only in the spring where we see a lot of bee activity in the forest. And again, it's to coincide with that high availability of light and intensity of flowering, both in the understory and in the canopy. So that brings me to another student project that I'll talk about briefly. And so this was work done by a PhD student in my lab, Evelyn Alicream. And she was interested in what bees are doing in the forest, and are they really just hanging out in the understory like us, or are they making use of canopy resources? And so she sampled bees using basically pan traps. Again, these are like cups in 3 different colors, and she used a slingshot mechanism to throw a rope over a tree branch and hoist it up so that she could have these traps up in the canopy. This is not to scale here. So these cups would be at least 20 meters above ground. And then she had another set on the bottom of the trees. And so she repeated this across multiple tree species over the course of spring 2021. And she collected 1,400 bees doing this. And to our surprise, she found that basically 2/3 of them were up in the canopy. And yeah, we knew they would use the canopy, but we didn't know that they would actually be preferentially up in the canopy. So what are they doing up there? Well, probably some of them actually nest up there. So as I mentioned, most bees nest in the ground, and that was even true. Most of the bees that we found in the canopy are ground nesters. But there are some species that nest in wood, and I'm showing a few of them here. And one of them, this beautiful green sweat bee, Agochlora pura, is a bee that we find commonly in forests, and it nests in wood, rotting wood in particular. And that seems to be something that it's able to find up in the canopy, although I would think also on the forest floor. These mason bees occupy existing holes in dead wood, so like holes that beetles have made, for example. And so those, of course, are present in forest and up in the canopy as well. But we think the main thing that bees are doing, including the ground nesting bees, is they're feeding on tree pollen, possibly nectar, although we don't have direct evidence of that. But we know they're feeding on pollen because Evelyn dissected the guts of 424 bees and looked at the pollen contents of their guts, and she was able to identify that pollen to determine that they are mainly consuming tree pollen. And mostly what they were using, at least in this area of forest, was maple pollen. Okay, so they're visiting tree flowers. And I should say, ours was one of a couple of studies that has looked at this. So we know, and we're sort of gaining appreciation that bees are really using these canopy resources that we didn't used to think of as being particularly adapted for attracting bees or particularly useful to bees, but they're definitely consuming this tree pollen. Now, does that matter for the trees? Probably not. So most of our canopy trees are wind pollinated. They are not, like I mentioned, they're not producing nectar for the most part, although maples are an exception. And so they're adequately pollinated by wind. If a bee is collecting some of that pollen, it may or may not be actually transporting pollen to another tree to affect cross-pollination. So yeah, they're probably not terribly important as pollinators, and yet for species like maples that do produce nectar, it suggests that there is a benefit to the tree in attracting animal pollinators, and so maybe they do actually play an important role in pollination for some trees. Where pollinators are really important for plant reproduction is in the understory. And I'll acknowledge first that there are some species in the understory that can set seed without pollinator assistance. And one interesting example is the violets. So these showy flowers on violets do require pollinator visits to make seed. But violets also produce what are called cleistogamous flowers. They're closed structures that actually don't require cross-pollination and don't require pollination at all. They pollinate themselves, and so they can make seed without pollinators. Sedges are wind pollinated. Hepaticas can self-pollinate. So there's various other strategies that we do see in the forest understory. However, there's a huge number of plants that either require or at least benefit from pollinator visits for the reproduction. And so these are some examples here that are either entirely or partially dependent on animal pollinators to move their pollen around and to ensure the production of viable seed. Most understory plants are long-lived perennials, and I say that because that means that if they don't get adequately pollinated in one year, if there's a bad year for pollinators or just a bad weather year where pollinators can't be active during flowering, that's not the end of the world for those plants. They can bloom again the following year and have another chance to make seed. Of course, it would be bad if there were a successive series of bad pollination years. So these understory perennials do have some resilience to at least temporary pollinator absence. The other thing is that most of these understory species are not very specialized in terms of their pollinator requirements, meaning they can be pollinated by a range of different insects, whether it's flies or bumblebees or solitary bees. There are some exceptions. So the lady slipper orchids seem to be mainly pollinated by bumblebees. Jack in the pulpit mainly pollinated by fungus gnats. So there are some examples of more specialized pollination, but for the most part, these are generalized plants that can be visited and are visited by a range of different species. Okay, so hopefully I have given you an idea of just how abundant and diverse pollinators are in woodlands. And I have hopefully also shown you that pollinators are important for woodlands, particularly the reproduction of understory plants. I want to say a little bit more about how woodlands support pollinators. And I'm sure some of the ways in which woodlands support pollinators are already obvious from what I've said so far. So clearly woodlands can provide abundant pollen and nectar resources, both in the understory and in the canopy, although primarily in the spring. And they also can provide nesting habitat in the form of trees, the wood that many bees use, but also just the ground. There are many bees that are nesting in the forest soil. But I want to highlight some of the other ways in which forests are important for bees and other pollinators. And to do so, I'll point to a couple of recent papers that have come out. So this one, well, it's getting less and less recent, but anyway, 2021 still seems pretty recent to me. So this is a big review paper that talked about the importance and really our growing recognition of the importance of forests for bumblebees specifically. And what they highlight in this paper is the fact that, again, forests provide abundant floral resources for bumblebees in the spring, both on the understory and the canopy, but they also provide seemingly very important overwintering habitat. So we don't know a whole lot about where bumblebees overwinter other than that it's underground. But there's some work to indicate that they are primarily doing that or preferentially doing that in the forest floor. And one specific study that was done at Tufts University, also in 2021, looked specifically at where bumblebees like to build their nests. And they focused on the common eastern bumblebee, shown here. And they surveyed for nests both in hayfields and in meadows and forests over 2 years. And what they found was that nest density, it was low in hayfields, but basically nests occurred both in meadows and forests. And what they also found was that nests are far more successful in forests. So in their sample, they looked at the total number of new queens that were produced by each nest. So that's basically a measure of the reproductive success of a bee nest. And they found that in both years, it was higher in forests than in meadows. And of course, there were no nests in hayfields. Another review paper that came out just 2 years ago looked at the role of forests, or discussed the role of forests, or the importance of forests for pollinators more broadly. And not only for pollinator diversity, but also for pollination of adjacent crops. And in this paper, the authors discuss some of the things I've already talked about, but they also talk about the fact that forest-dependent pollinators can spill over into neighboring habitat. So pollinators like those bumblebees that are opting to nest in forests will then often forage in adjacent fields and therefore be doing pollination in those adjacent fields, which can be crop fields. There's a lot of evidence for this in tropical systems, but there's also some evidence, this is mainly from work done by Cass Urban Mead, actually, yeah, so her paper, I'm showing it here, she has found that in apple orchards, a huge number of the pollinators that are seen and are known to be important pollinators in apple orchards were in the adjacent forest shortly before. So she's looked at where these pollinators are over the course of the spring season, and they start out in the forest and then they show up on apple blossom and they're consuming tree pollen and then they're consuming apple pollen. Another way in which forests can be really helpful for bees is something that, again, more and more people are thinking about this, talking about it. And in my lab, we've done some work on this topic of woodlands as basically climate refuges. And our work on this topic was done by Roisin Kierstead, who was a master's student in my lab, co-supervised by Ilana Niokaitis-Lewis, who's a researcher at Environment and Climate Change Canada. And what we were interested in here is whether forest remnants in our very agricultural landscape around here act as climate refugia for wild bees and wasps. And so Roisin established these artificial nesting structures. We use these a lot in my lab. And she set these up in forested and unforested field margins. And the great thing about this is all of these wood nesting bees and wasps will build their nests in here, and we line the holes with paper straws that we can extract so we can see what's going on inside, and we can even monitor the reproductive success, like the survival and number of offspring produced in each nest. And we also logged internal temperatures within these nesting blocks, both in the forested and unforested margins. And the two big results that Roisin got, Well, the first one will not surprise you, I'm sure, but in the forested margins, it's just much cooler. So the average daily maximum temperature over the course of a summer was about 7 degrees lower in forested margins compared to open margins. And this part was actually kind of a surprise, but we found that survival of bee and wasp larvae was significantly higher in the forested margins. Now, we don't yet know why. We don't know if that's because of the temperature effect, and that's something we're going to have to do more work on. But it certainly suggests that forests are playing a valuable role in supporting these bees and wasps and allowing them to complete their life cycles, possibly through this thermal buffering that forests are responsible for. Okay, so I'll just wrap up by saying forest pollinators aren't always visible, especially to us when we're concentrating on the understory, but they're certainly around, especially in early spring, and they are super important for the reproduction of many forest understory plants. And finally, forests, even small ones, provide vital habitat for many bees and other pollinators. Larger forests can provide more habitat, they can support more numbers of bees and more species of bees, but the advantage is not huge. So even a small forest can support good numbers of bees and a pretty high species richness of forest-associated bees. So while this is something we've tended to ignore in the past, I think there's growing awareness of this really important role of forests for pollinators. So with that, I'll just be happy to take any questions.
Great note to end it on. Thanks so much, Jessica.